Hello, I'm Bart Walsh. This series is called Care of the Self, and we've been talking about sources of chronic emotional states or other problem states like chronic anxiety, chronic depression, and we're going to address a third source of chronic emotional conditions, and this source really is genetics. Some of us are hardwired genetically to experience chronic depression or chronic anxiety. Some of us are hardwired genetically to experience chronic anxiety or chronic depression. Now, this hardwiring I like to call a force. I use the term force when I'm communicating with the unconscious because it seems to, well, in the English language, it seems to work quite well. And so, if you've got chronic anxiety or chronic depression or some other chronic condition, you can, first of all, develop the signaling system with the unconscious through your fingers, so that one finger lifts up as a yes response from the unconscious, a different finger lifts up as a no response. You'll need to do that, and that information is in a previous segment. But once you have that signaling system with your unconscious, you can ask the unconscious, is there a force deep within responsible for developing and maintaining anxiety in my experience, or whatever other condition you're dealing with. And be patient awaiting a response, because this requires quite a search. If you get a yes, then I say, well, I'm going to call this the anxiety force, and are there any parts contributing to this anxiety force? Since we all have many, many parts inside doing different things, serving different functions, are there any parts contributing to this anxiety force? And if you get a yes, then you want to get an exact number of parts. Are there more than 2 parts? Are there more than 4 parts? Are there more than 10 parts? I always pray for low numbers, but do your best to get close to an exact number of parts contributing to this condition. And then realize that a part working for the anxiety force has a job requirement, and that is to be anxious. Any part working for the anxiety force is going to be anxious. Any part working for the depressive force is going to be depressed. And these parts may be both depressed and anxious. And so, once I get a number on the parts working for the force, then I will ask the unconscious, will the anxiety that these parts carry now be resolved so they can be free of that? And if I get a yes, then I'll ask the yes finger to lift up when these parts are free of anxiety. Once that happens, then I'll ask, are these parts also experiencing depression? If I get a yes, then I'll ask that the depression be resolved, and have a yes finger lift up when they're free of depression. Okay. Now sometimes when I ask that the anxiety be resolved for these parts working for the anxiety force, I'll get a no. And then I will explain, I understand that these parts have anxiety because it's a requirement for them working for the anxiety force, but these parts are going to be doing something different very soon, and they will need to be free of anxiety in order to function on that different job. Then I'll ask, so will the anxiety now be resolved? Typically I'll get a yes once I offer that explanation. So, and with a depressive force, the same thing is true. Sometimes I'll get a no, they can't be free of depression. And then I'll explain, I understand they're depressed because they're working for the depressive force. blah, 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 same strategy. Once these parts are free of anxiety, free of depression, then I will talk to these parts and explain, soon this anxiety force you've been working for is going to become inactive. And when that happens, you won't have anything to do. You won't have any way to direct your energy or attention. The good news is that there is another job available, and it's a job that's good for the whole system. So then what I do is describe a job that I've created, essentially. And for instance, these parts working for the anxiety force, I may say, the new job is a calming job. It attempts to keep the entire system as calm as possible, because everything in the system works best when the system is calm. All of the organs function best when the system is calm. The immune system functions best when the system is calm. The calming job is a wonderful benefit and complement to health and vitality. And the parts doing the calming job can be as creative as they like in finding ways to calm the system. So you might introduce a calming thought or image. Well, there's lots of possible ways that these parts can attempt to develop calm in the system. And sometimes I'll say that the parts, if the system is anxious, they can change that negative outcome future picture to a positive outcome future picture to stop the anxiety, and that will help calm the system. So I'll ask these parts, would you like to take this very important calming job before you're out of work altogether? Typically the parts will say yes. And then I'll say you can start the calming job now, and I'll encourage you to be very patient with yourself, because as with any new job, it takes time to get things figured out, and you've got all the time necessary to figure out this calming job. So please be patient with yourselves. And suggest that they start the job now. And I wait a minute for them to kind of get on the bus and go to the job, or however they do it. And then I will ask, when these parts have all moved on to the calming job, will the anxiety force then be turned off completely? And typically I'll get a yes, and then I'll ask the yes finger to lift up when the anxiety force is completely turned off. Okay, so then you have turned off the source of chronic anxiety. And this is a big deal. Now, because it's genetic, it's going to get triggered back on again. And so it's important to check regularly, once a day is best, to see if the force is on or off. And if it's on, then you want to go through the same process. And if it's on, you can ask, are the parts contributing to the anxiety force the same parts that previously had a new job? And quite often you'll get a yes. And so after you've resolved their anxiety, you can say, that new job is good for the system, and this anxiety force is a big problem for the system, so will you please return to that new job? Typically they'll say yes, and then you can wait a minute for them to transport themselves elsewhere, and then ask that the anxiety force be turned off. Okay, so that's the basic process for getting at a problem force, or something that is genetically driven that I call a force. You need to check regularly on these forces to keep them turned off. And what I've discovered is the more these forces are turned off, the longer they'll stay off. Longer stretches of time they'll stay off. But it puts you in charge of the force, and it's really quite nice. Now, my system was hardwired for both an anxiety force and a depressive force, so I know well what a difference it makes to keep those puppies turned off. Okay. Now, one challenge is, of course, creating jobs for the parts that we're working for the force. You can be as creative as you like and just consider anything that you'd like a little extra help with. It could be the simplest thing. And you just need to describe the duties of the job to these parts and then ask them if they'd like the job. Bingo. And then they start the job, and you can check on them in the future to see how the job is going and realize it may take them a little time to get the parameters of the job all figured out and activated. But this works quite well. So this is about turning off a genetic driver of a chronic condition, or a force, as I call it, because the unconscious seems to be quite responsive to that term. I'd encourage you, anytime you're thinking of something that you'd like just a little extra help with, or like to do a little bit better, to write it down and consider it a job. But you can get great benefit out of, well, dealing with the force, well, transforming the force into something else. So we'll be talking about that in another sequence. But for now, thank you for watching, and realize that this information is all in the Care of the Self Owner's Manual book. Okay, hope to see you in the next sequence. Bye for now.